standing in front of what I guess is now a sort of iconic piece from the mid-'80s, from Jim's Milwaukee Avenue period, and it's called Evening of My Dysfunction. You'd mentioned earlier, Jim, that this painting stands in for a lot of other paintings.
This painting has this sort of strong figurative landscape narrative element to the background of the painting, and my work of this time was more characterized by that sort of narrative work than it was by this central image. So I think this is maybe the first piece where this strong sort of abstract form sort of successfully found itself in some kind of narrative relationship to the other things in the painting. And that continued in my work for a while, and I think this is the first example.
But could you talk a little bit about how, because I think this is really important, about the relationship between abstraction and figuration in your work, about how the biomorphic blob in the center of the painting came into being. You know, you mentioned that you actually teased it out rather than it having a kind of improvisational character.
Well, we were talking about this earlier, that in my sort of worldview of painting, that neither figurative representational work or abstract work has ever quite held sway. So I would start a lot of paintings, even before this, by just doing automatic painting processes. I would take a brush loaded up with something and try and sort of empty out my mind. And so this painting is an example of one of those. Other paintings that are maybe much less obviously that are also of the same variety. I mean, during this time frame, that is the way I worked.
Right.
You know, there may be one or two pieces where I had an idea and I would execute a drawing and then work from that. But by and large, this is the method, and this is the method I still use.
And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Air-Conditioned Nightmare, and because you can see in the background that there's a bed, that there is clearly a setting, and then the mark making is very unruly and all over. But how did it come to be, I guess?
1989 was a pretty important year in my development. This tension had been building up that I was interested in abstract painting, and I employed it in the early stages of my other work. But to sort of invert that, basically, and bring the abstract, basically use an abstract language to sort of tell this more narrative element. And in this one, I sort of sacrificed a little bit of the clarity of the narrative to, sort of privilege the mark making and this sort of atmospherics that go on here.
Well, the clarity of the narrative comes in the title.
Yeah, right. Well, I always use titles in my work to kind of clue in the narrative. I mean, Evening of My Dysfunction could have had a different title and would have been something different. But in this one, it's in simple terms, just a kind of memory painting, of a cold room, in a hot town, which I grew up in, a cold room in a hot town.
Writing about the work, Jim, I made a point about characterizing this moment as like you arriving your own brand of postmodernism, which is very funny to talk about it as a kind of version of self-reflexivity or criticality about one's own activity. That you're suddenly become, postmodernism as a form of self-consciousness, basically, right? And so before, we were talking about the relationship between the figure and the ground, the marks, and then the place where the marks can be, or the marks having a life of their own, and the ground having a life independent of those marks. If you could talk a little bit about that transition, and I know it relates to drawing.
The painting came about in a different way and for a different sort of reason. This painting marks one of the first that I made using these found images for the background. And what preceded it was a body of work where I started to work from those drawings I was talking about earlier, the working drawings, which would be small ink and brush drawings about this size. At a certain point, it occurred to me that my drawings over the years had always been sort of ahead of my paintings in terms of, you know, what the image was that was you know, most compelling to me at any given time. That when I started to paint, the process of painting, because it's so much more difficult and drawn out, would tend to kind of subdue the imagery. But when I would draw and it would come out directly, then it would be very much bolder and much more direct. And so I decided to do some paintings where I just painted from those drawings. I just copied the drawings, basically, to show myself what it would look like as a painting. And I did those with just gray backgrounds because I didn't want to think about the background. I just wanted to have the image be there. And then that didn't work so well. I mean, none of those ever really worked, except I learned how to make these larger images from the drawings. And so finding some imagery for the background that came from the TV. This image came from the nightly news. It's a crime scene photograph, file photo. But it seemed to me to make sense as the next step from gray being this kind of meaningless image stream, which, so anyway, and so I sorted through, I had thousands of these pictures, and I sorted through for one that seemed to have some resonance or correlation to an image, to a drawing that I'd made. A stack of drawings, a stack of images, and sort of look at them and say, okay, well, this drawing somehow looks like it belongs with this image.
Hi, my name is Hamza Walker. I'm the Associate Curator here at the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago. We're located at 5811 South Ellis Avenue on the main campus of the university. And behind me is a painting entitled Last Train to Wherever. It's an example of the work of Jim Lutes, and we have a survey of his paintings up through February 14th. Our hours are Tuesday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., Saturday and Sunday, noon to 5 p.m. And for more information, you can go to our website. That's renaissancesociety.org.
This program is partially supported by a grant from the Illinois Arts Council, a state agency.